What's going on, guys? It's going to be our summary of markets week 50. We're going to start with SPY and then go into gold, oil, Bitcoin, and then Ethereum as always. Then we're going to talk about the options watch list. So it was a pretty quiet week for most of the indexes. SPY didn't really do too much. You weren't able to gain that 382 level that we were watching. It looked pretty bullish going into Friday, but then you opened up Monday with a small gap down, tried to push higher, and you just weren't able to break that 382. So you did sell off. I told you guys to keep an eye on like 378 as your bearish trigger. We did actually gap below that, so it didn't really give you a clean break. It kind of gapped below, but you are currently below that level. So as long as you stay below 378, I would say you should be slightly bearish. And then you have a little bit of support around 372 with that OTS trail and that fib level. If you do break below 372, I would keep an eye on like 366, kind of around that 50 moving average and that fib support. If you do reclaim 378, you can watch for 382 again, and then that final target would be around 387. Moving on to gold, not a whole lot happening. You're still kind of in that downtrend. You did try to push higher last week. You failed that. You failed that pivot, and then you nuked downward. Or sorry, that was the week before. And then last week showed you continuation. You had a little bit of accumulation, and now we are kind of failing downward. Look at the Momo. The Momo is giving you that bearish pinch, and you are going down. You did almost lose this most recent support. If you lose that level, you have a little bit of support around 1810. Once you lose that 1810, you could see a strong sell-off down into the lower range of this kind of downtrend here. So keep an eye on that support. Very, very big level that needs to hold. You do have a little bit of support around that kind of middle of the range where it's like 1780 depending on where you hit it. But if you do lose those two levels, you could nuke down to 1700 pretty easily. You do have a lot of stimulus talks coming in, especially with Biden taking office. So that should, it doesn't have to, like I said last week, but it should help gold and silver. The problem with gold and silver is it's a very crowded trade. So everyone is expecting it to go up because of stimulus. So there are so many people already crowding into this trade that it could easily go down by just stopping these people out and creating kind of a bearish catalyst. But if that stimulus does get passed, it should hurt the dollar and then increase gold and silver. So keep an eye on that. Moving on to oil, basically the bullish trend is just continuing. You did hit our two targets, 52.60, 54. Both those targets were hit, and now we're seeing a little bit of sell pressure. You can see that you're a little extended off the trail. It's about the most we've been extended since this bullish trend took off. So you probably will pull back a little bit. If you go down to like a 4-hour, you can see that we kind of have like a little bit of a double top coming in, and then we broke that support. So as long as you're below like $53, this is short-term bearish. You are bouncing off the 50 moving average, so a little bit of support there, but you really have to reclaim 53 as soon as possible. Okay, so keep an eye on 53. You reclaim 53. You still have that target at 54.10, which you could hit for a second time, and then your breakout targets would be around 59. Very likely that you do pull back to retest the trail around like $50, so keep an eye on that. Moving on to Bitcoin, not a whole lot happened since our last video. You are kind of just ranging after finding that resistance around 42,000. You did put in a lower high. You kind of popped up and retested that doji. So that resistance came in around that doji, and then we sold off, creating that lower high. So you are losing your short-term momentum. Long-term momentum, just barely holding on to that trend. We have not lost this trend since like early in October. This bullish trend has been holding all the way up on the Momo. So the trend is still strong for now, but if that Momo does lose that 10 line, you could start to see a pretty strong sell-off down into like 28,000. So keep an eye on that. For now, I would be slightly bullish, probably closer to neutral. Just as the OTS is showing you, it's kind of neutral on the OTS. Go down to a 4-hour. You can see that you're definitely bearish short term. You put in a lower high, put in another lower high. We are kind of finding support on these pivots. So you're kind of, like I said, neutral. You're stuck between support and resistance. If Bitcoin loses these two pivots around 33,000, very likely going to go lower down to that 28. But if we are able to bounce off of these pivots, push above 38, we do need to break this high here to get rid of that lower high structure. But back above 40,000, we should be able to get 43.5 and 45.6. Okay, so keep an eye on all those levels. Right now, like I said, short term a little bearish, long term you're kind of neutral / bullish. Moving on to Ethereum, basically the same thing. Not a whole lot of pressure on either side. You're kind of stuck in between a range. You did put in a lower high here, but you still are kind of on that high. So it's a little more bullish on Ethereum. You can see that the momentum still has not gone negative like it has on Bitcoin. You can also see that on the Momo trend line, you are a lot higher, closer to that 15 range than that 10 range. So Bitcoin is kind of threatening to lose that trend, but Ethereum is not. Ethereum is slightly more bullish. As I go down to the lower time frame, you can see that even on the 4-hour, it is still green on that OTS. So you can see that you are still kind of holding that uptrend. You're above the 50 moving average. It's giving you buy signals. So Ethereum looks like it wants to go higher compared to Bitcoin. So keep an eye on that correlation. Ethereum might lead this next breakout if you break above 1300. So you want to break this lower high structure on Ethereum, and then you could lead the markets higher. If it does break 1300, watch for 1376. Your breakout target would be around 1600. But that is it for the summary of markets. Let's move on to the options watch list. So not a whole lot changed from last week. Most of the plays we were still watching, but a lot of our targets were hit from last week. So we did have Peloton break out of that 162 range. We hit our 168 target, we hit our 170 target, and that basically became the high almost to the tick. So beautiful trade there. If you guys followed that video or you guys followed the trade in Discord, that was a fantastic trade. Now we are pulling back. We're below that pivot. You're putting in kind of a top doji here. So definitely a little bearish. But short term, if we do hold on to this uptrend here and get back above 161, we could revisit that pivot around 166. There's also a pivot there on the daily around 163. Okay, so watch for that short-term bounce. You could probably hit those pivots. PLTR, you tried to go higher off that Cathie Wood news. Cathie Wood was buying it up in one of her ETFs. So people tried to push that higher, but you were not able, once again, to close above 2650. So that VWAP is still holding as resistance. And then you also have that pivot around 28.25, which also acted as resistance. So until those two levels are taken, you are still you're still bearish. Now, obviously, long term, this is still kind of a bullish distribution. You're kind of in that bullish pennant pattern. But short term, you're not bullish until you break that VWAP around 26.5 or that pivot around 28.25. Okay, so I would lean bearish. Watch for support around 24. You lose that support, very likely going to go back down to 20. AMD, you are failing bearishly out of this bullish distribution pattern, but you do kind of have a descending triangle there too, so you could have leaned bearish. A little bit of dark cloud cover, gap down, and then continuation. So until you reclaim like 94, this would be bearish. Look for the pivots around 82.50 and then 83 VWAP. You have a little bit of support coming in on these highs around 88. Not sure how long those will hold though. Moving on to Neo. Neo, kind of the same thing, pulling back to support. You did just break this recent high back here. So until you reclaim that high at 57, probably going to come back down to fill this gap around 54. You also have the OTS trail around 53, so keep an eye on that. But reclaiming like 57 to 60, that would be very bullish. Moving on to Chegg, our targets are finally hit. We had a target at 100 and a target at 103, 103.50. Both of those targets were hit. So if you guys were in that trade is finally finished. Now, where I'd look for a re-entry on this is if you pull back to 95 or around 90 and start to find support, that would be a good bounce play. Moving on to Teladoc, another one that Cathie Wood has been buying a lot of. You are kind of in a bullish accumulation, sorry, a bullish distribution pattern here. If you hold above 221, you break the pivot at 237, you should be able to go higher into 240, 250. But keep an eye on that pivot. No play until that pivot is broken. Moving on to Starbucks, you have a white to black shift here. The bears are taking control. If it does not bounce soon, that OTS trail will flip red, and you have not had a red trail on the Starbucks chart for a long time. So this could be finally entering a pullback or a downtrend. So not looking too good. If you do reclaim like 105, look for like 107. Moving on to Zillow, perfect pullback to this pivot. If you do hold on to that pivot and that OTS trail, this could be a bounce play up into like 145, but this could also turn into a head and shoulders. So you could try to bounce here and then kind of fail around that 141 and then head lower. So be careful there. But as long as this pivot holds and the OTS below that, this is still slightly bullish. Moving on to Square, you had a gap play here. You basically filled the gap. You missed it by probably less than $1. Bitcoin started to sell off a little bit, so it pulled Square back. Square looks good above 225, above 222. You have a lot of support down here, but you are kind of putting in a double top, so not a whole lot of buyers stepping in as price goes up. So if price does break that 239, 240, you want to see that volume. You want to see those buyers step in. Moving on to PIN, kind of the same thing here. Buyers are not stepping in on this higher price. Most likely going to pull back down to that pivot or that OTS trail to see if we can find some buyers again. So keep an eye on that. AI, we had a short-term play here. I called this out in Discord. I said your short-term target was 150, 150. If you weren't able to get above that, it was going to pull back and retrace. Your next target would have been 158, but you can see that it did not like that level, so it failed pretty much perfectly. Now we are breaking bearishly out of this triangle here. You're below a lot of resistance now, so it would need a lot of buyers to get back above like 140, 145. If you do reclaim 145, keep an eye on 157. In the meantime, most likely going to go back down to 127 or towards that 120 area. Moving on to Nordstrom. Nordstrom hit our target, our final target actually, almost to the penny. Final target being 38.22. Yeah, to the penny, it hit our final target. Look at that. The high is 38.22. So beautiful there. That trade is played out. Wait for a pullback to support. You could pull back to like 34.30 or 33. So keep an eye on that. Moving on to Walmart. Walmart gap down here. You did bounce out of a weekly support. You did have a weekly pivot down here, but the buyers did not like that recent VWAP. So keep an eye on the buyers to step in around 141. If they hold that weekly pivot, this could start to push higher. I'm keeping an eye on a lot of these consumer staple companies. I like the XLP sector ETF. I'm keeping an eye on the dip here. You have a lot of earnings coming up for a lot of these companies. So keep an eye on Walmart, keep an eye on Costco, Procter & Gamble, companies like that. I'm looking for a buy the dip scenario on a lot of these companies. So Walmart would be one of them. And I think Walmart has earnings, pretty soon. So keep an eye on that with Walmart. As long as you hold the weekly pivot, it should be okay. Moving on to Target. Target had a pretty strong breakout here up into the 200 range, but it did not like that 200 level. You failed that level almost to the penny and started to sell off. Very big psychological number. So when you are extending off your trend, pushing into levels like that, you really have to have a lot of buyers step in or you're not going to push higher. So that's basically what happened with Target. The buyers don't like that higher price, so most likely will pull back towards 191 or around, 191 would be basically the support on both time frames. So watch that kind of low 190 range. If support steps in there, you could push higher. Moving on to Ulta, you did hit our short-term target around 299, 300. You hit our fake out level at 303, but you were not able to close above that level. You had 2 daily candles. Try to break that level and fail. So very likely will come back down, retest 300, retest 290 before going higher. But if buyers do step in above 305, you should be able to go into 317 or 322. Keep an eye on that. Disney, you pulled back and you broke that daily pivot around what is that 174. So as long as you're below that that daily pivot, this will most likely go lower. You have a massive gap below you that still needs to be filled. So watch out for that. Now, one thing to note with Disney, they did just release their first ever Marvel series on Disney Plus, WandaVision, on Friday. So if they come out and randomly release a statement on like, oh, we had hundreds of thousands of users sign up for WandaVision, so stuff like that, if they release a headline like that, that should be very bullish. So be careful if you're shorting Disney. They could just randomly release how well they're doing with subscribers with that new show. They did that last time, which I think was the bump up here or the bump up here. They released how well their numbers were just randomly. It wasn't during their earnings call or anything, and it pushed their price up. So be a little careful. They could do that if you are in some puts. But if it does get back above 174, keep an eye on that 180. Moving on to American Eagle. I don't think I have a play on American Eagle anymore. You hit our targets. Watch for a pullback around 21. Jeffries, same thing. Hit our target. Watch for a pullback around 25. Cloud, no trade on that right now. Enviz, you would have to get above $7 and hold. I want to see a daily close above $7. If you do that, very likely we'll get 750 to 835. But until the daily closes up there, it's looking pretty weak. Nasty sell volume coming in around these levels. You can see the wicks coming in on the dailies. It doesn't look very good. You really need a strong daily close with no top wick. Moving on to Lemonade. Lemonade hit our second breakout target around 189, and then you put in a top doji, put in a pivot, and now we're nuking back down to support. If it holds 137 to 144, this can go higher back into 170s, but be careful. They did announce a stock offering. That is why they sold off. Moving on, CRISPR, it looked pretty good, had a nice breakout, but then it failed downwards. So it looks a little bad now. Watch for 172, the OTS trail, kind of around 180. You could find some buyers stepping in there. CERT, I like CERT here. If CERT holds above like 36.50 to 37, you should be able to go higher. You really need to get above this sell pressure here that you saw on this daily candle. And then you also have a little bit of resistance around like 38 on that doji kind of high there. But if you break those two levels, very likely we'll go into all-time high or at least get to like $40. Moving on to Home Depot, you do have a little bit of a break of VWAP here around 275, but you do need a strong close kind of above 280 for this to really break out of this massive downtrend resistance that you're currently in. You can see on the weekly, this is a beautiful candle. It's starting to push higher out of this distribution. You kind of have those black candles turning off, so your trend is trying to shift bullish. A lot of good volume came in as well. So if this turns white, or if you have default candles green on the OTS, this should go higher. You have a lot of VWAP resistance around like 281, but if you start to close above like 282, 283, this should break higher very easily. Snapchat pulling back to the OTS trail. They were selling off, I believe, from the social media sell-off that we're seeing from the Trump ban. So they didn't really like that. They announced that they permanently banned Trump, and it basically has been selling off ever since, which is very weird because Trump doesn't really use Snapchat. So it's not like their platform is going to lose a lot of engagement. So this could be an irrational sell-off. Out of all the social medias that are selling off from the Trump stuff, I would think that Snapchat is going to bounce quicker than most of the other ones. So keep an eye on Snapchat. If you do hold above like 52.5, you should be able to push higher. Nvidia, we almost got faked out on this trade. I thought it was breaking 550 finally. I was almost about to buy this for a breakout, and then we ended up daily closing below 550, and I decided not to touch it. And then look at what it's doing now. It's selling off pretty strong. So you're seeing a pretty strong sell-off in the semiconductor index. So if you look at like SMH for the ETF, the semiconductors are hitting a resistance level, and you're starting to see a strong sell-off. So you're also seeing that in like AMD. AMD is getting a strong sell-off. You have Nvidia selling off. So the semiconductors are not doing too well. I don't like Nvidia until you get back above 550. If you do want to buy the dip, it would be somewhere around 505 if that level holds. Moving on to Zoom, I told you guys around that gap fill would have been the buy. Sadly, it filled that gap pre-market, so we missed our entry. I didn't want to chase this, but our targets are being hit. So our first target was the OTS trail, that got hit. Second target was the VWAP here, that got hit. Our next targets for the long-term swing trade are 425, 428, somewhere around that VWAP, 445, which is that pivot, and then 517, which is that VWAP up there. So watch those targets if Zoom continues to break out here. Intel, we're not looking for a trade on that. ACI, that trade has already played out. Dash, beautiful breakout there. We called the bottom on that. I told you guys that 140 was seeing massive buyers way back. I think it was last week or the week before. And then the buyers stepped up and pushed it all the way to 221. So beautiful breakout there. It needs some time to cool off. It might pull back to like 170, 175, even around 180 you have support. So anywhere kind of in that area, if you start to accumulate, that could be a decent buy the dip, kind of around IPO price. So keep an eye on that. I would not buy it here, though. You are cooling off from a massive breakout. Same thing with Airbnb. We took the same exact trade basically on Airbnb that we took on DoorDash. We made a very nice profit on that. We hit our target around 174, so we went ahead and closed it. It did break out higher, so we could have made a little bit more money on that, but our trade was beautiful. We basically had zero drawdown. It just instantly went up when we bought it, so very easy trade. Same thing with this. It is cooling off from a massive breakout, so keep an eye on kind of around like 160, 165, even like 168, kind of where it is. If you start to accumulate down here, you could go higher, so keep an eye on that. Moving on to Fedex. Fedex had a very nice downtrend break here. You bounced off the daily pivot. I did say that you had to close above 255. You did not like that 255 level. You're seeing a lot of resistance around that level. You're getting a lot of sellers stepping in. So until you start closing above 255, this is most likely going to retest kind of the lower that accumulation around 245. Now, if you do close above 255, watch for that OTS trail around 262. You start flipping that trail, 272, 282 would be your overall targets. Moving on to TLS, I told you guys that this looked very bullish. You had a low time frame breakout of a bullish pennant. It looked very, very strong. You broke through our fake out level at 35. You broke into our targets at 36 and 37. Next targets at 39. So you hit almost every single one of our targets. The only target remaining would be 42. And it doesn't look like it's going to get that very easily. You do see a lot of sellers stepping in. One thing to keep an eye on, if you do hold above 36.50, a lot of buyers start stepping in there. You could push into that final target. Same thing with 34. So you have two little support zones. Keep an eye on those. BLL, you're finally starting to find some buyers here. You do have a slight bull div on your Momo, I believe. So watch this falling wedge. If you start to break out of it, you want to watch for that 96 as your main target. Then you could even go into 100 as well. Affirm was a new IPO. You saw a massive buyer step in. I told you guys that it looked very bullish on this little triangle down here. You did break out of that. You ran higher, and then the sellers finally stepped in. So looking at this on like a 1 hour, it does look like the buyers are coming back, but look at the volume. The volume is completely dead on this buy up here. So very likely a fake out unless you see very strong momentum coming in on kind of the start of the day, start of the week on Tuesday. So I think I did say Monday a few times in the summary markets, but remember that Monday is a holiday, so everything starts on Tuesday. If you see some strong momentum coming in on Tuesday, this could go higher, but the buyers are very weak right now. United Natural Foods was a short squeeze play that I called out. We called it out way back here around 19. You broke out of this very long-term triangle here. I was watching the weekly pivot around 22. You really have to get a strong close above that weekly pivot before you can start short squeezing into the 30s. So if the weekly pivot or a couple days show strong momentum above 22, you should be able to get into the 26 to 30 range where those shorts will start to get squeezed. So keep an eye on that. CIIC is a SPAC company. If you guys like trading SPACs, it looked like it was going to break out of this trend, but then you found a lot of sellers. You are currently holding VWAP though, the December VWAP. So if you stay above that VWAP, you break these sell wicks here that we're seeing, you could be able to go into 34 to 36 pretty easily. But this gap up here and then insta sell off is pretty ugly. So you want to see a lot of buy pressure step in to go higher. Cciv is another SPAC company that we're keeping an eye on. You saw some massive momentum come in because of a news announcement, quote unquote, that was being talked about on Twitter. Nothing really came out of that news announcement, so it kind of sold off immediately. I do think if it holds 18, that you can definitely go higher. So if you start finding buy pressure above 18, above 19, you could break into the 22 range. So keep an eye on that. Moving on to Overstock, we actually ended up closing this trade because of that nasty sell-off that we got. This was a beautiful trade. We let a little bit of our profit go, but we took this trade. It instantly started breaking out. We were up 11% on our shares. I ended up closing it for, I think, like 3 to 5% gain. So not a big gain. We gave up a lot of profit, but it was a very good setup. This could still go higher, but you really have to see a strong daily close outside of that trend line. Same thing with DraftKings. I took a small position here to ladder in to a breakout, but it did not break that resistance level. You basically failed it to the penny, so I went ahead and closed DraftKings for a loss. But I am still watching this DraftKings trade. If you can hold above 57, you could go into all-time highs. So keep an eye on DraftKings. Let's put an alert back above that level, just in case we break out. Moving on, MasterCard. This was on one of my scanners. I can't remember which one it was, but I do like this weekly pullback into the OTS trail. If you do start bouncing, you get above like 337. MasterCard should be able to go higher. This would be more of a longer term play though. Nautilus was not able to break the resistance around 22. I was very strongly debating on buying this pullback on the close of Friday, but I did not like the buy pressure that we were getting on the close, so I did not buy it, especially with a longer week, a weekend, so I didn't do that. But if we do see some strong momentum come in on Tuesday, I will buy this for a very tight stop loss inverse head and shoulders play. So keep an eye on that. Once it gets through this resistance around 22, 23, you should be able to get to 28 pretty easily. Nothing's changed on Honeywell. Still watching for a range breakout. Same thing with RTX. Rocket, this thing is really starting to bleed me out. I've already closed my options, getting very close to closing my shares if the buyers don't step in very soon. CVS looks really strong here. We just SR flipped this most recent high. You are failing this. I think it's a weekly or a monthly level. It's a monthly pivot. So we did just close above the anchored VWAP on our weekly. So that looks really bullish. But we do have to get a strong close above this monthly pivot. So this is really the only monthly resistance that we have until you get to like 95, 100. So this is a very long-term trade. I'm holding leaps on this for next January. But they look like they want to start playing out. So keep an eye on this. Above like 78, this thing could really go higher. Johnson & Johnson, same thing. Long term, it's looking very strong. You're breaking out of like a 3-year distribution here. So keep an eye on this breakout. As long as you stay above like 157, which is that 3-year distribution high, this can go a lot higher. They also have vaccine news that helps them out. So keep a strong eye on Johnson & Johnson mid to long term. Smile Direct is really starting to irritate me. We had a very strong breakout when we first took the trade, and then it's basically been selling off ever since. If it loses this weekly trend line, I'm probably going to cut this trade for a loss. I am holding leaps on this, so we got plenty of time, but the delta is really getting hurt because this is just selling off without any buyers. But keep an eye on this. If it does get above like 13, 14, this could short squeeze very, very high. Moving on to Microsoft, I have these charted out on this other chart here. So Microsoft is closing back below that trend line again. So this is looking pretty ugly. If you do not immediately reclaim this trend, it is most likely going to go down to 208. So keep an eye on that. You really want to get back into like 217 as soon as possible. Same thing with Apple. If Apple does not reclaim like 128 very soon, 128.50, it's going to look pretty bad. Most likely going to go down to 123, 125. And if you lose those levels, you could go a lot lower. So Apple needs to find some buyers this week, or it's not going to look very good into earnings. Facebook is getting absolutely destroyed on the Trump wave, I guess you would say, banning Trump. They are definitely not doing well. If it loses this 250 range, most likely going to go down to 234, which is that gap fill. So keep an eye on that. I would definitely lean bearish on this. They have been crushing earnings recently, so keep an eye on that. They could beat earnings again, but watch for that gap fill. Netflix, you also have earnings coming up, I believe, this week, so keep an eye on that. If it's not this week, it's going to be next week, but you really need to reclaim 510 as soon as possible. Netflix does have a gap at 520. As we know, Netflix loves to fill all of its gaps, so keep an eye on that. Very easy target if you are bullish. If it holds 490, it should be okay. You lose 490, going to go to 472. Amazon flirting with that trend line again. If it loses this trend line, this trade has been invalidated, which does kind of suck because you were damn near at your target, but it did not like that high there. So keep an eye on the invalidation. If you break this trend line, very likely going to 30.50, maybe 29.60. Tesla not looking too good here, to be honest. You had a very short-term, very bullish pattern here on Tesla. Typically, these patterns break out very bullishly when you set up for like a little triangle here on a high. Almost every time Tesla does this, it breaks higher. So seeing this break lower on pretty decent volume, it might kind of tell us that this is a local top here on Tesla, and Tesla is running out of buyers finally on the short term. So keep an eye on that. If Tesla does not reclaim this downtrend as soon as possible, very likely going to go lower into 800, maybe even like 750. Okay, so keep an eye on that downtrend. But all right, guys, that was it. That was the summary of markets. That was our watch list. Hopefully this helped you guys out. And I will be seeing you guys on Tuesday for our live trading session. You guys have a good rest of your weekend. Enjoy your holiday. I'll see you guys later. Peace out.